As most great things tend to do, feminism and the progressive suffrage movement got a large part of its start in New York City. While taking place a few years earlier than the turn of the century, the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 helped to launch a wave of activism not often seen. Women were taking to the streets and advocating for a new life for themselves. This was especially hard to do with not only the patriarchy embedding itself into society's greater consciousness, but also taking the form of concrete discriminatory legislation. The Comstock Act was passed March 3, 1873. It was championed by New York Society for the Suppression of Vice founder Anthony Comstock. The act formally made it illegal to send obscene, lewd, or lascivious, immoral, or indecent publications through the mail. It was commonly referred to as the chastity laws. The act also made birth control, a relatively recent development, a federal crime. In a city where mothers couldn't afford to feed themselves, let alone several children, child laborers ran rampant, and social welfare was more of a hobby for affluent women rather than a national standard, the criminalization of birth control practically doomed women to a life like the one seen in Maggie, Girl of the Streets. Stephen Crane's story of poverty, alcoholism, and domestic violence was one seen all too frequently in the streets of New York. In an attempt to solidify her standing with her boyfriend, protagonist Maggie has premarital sex and is effectively ruined. Her moral character is utterly destroyed, with no hope of redemption. She's left with no choice but to become a girl of the streets and sell her body for money. This culture of shame surrounding sex at the turn of the century gave women practically only two paths: morally virtuous wife or a sleazy, sinful streetwalker. Had Maggie and girls like her had access to safe and legal birth control, their pathways would have multiplied tenfold. The ability to choose when to have children was, and still is, an imperative part of both bodily autonomy and social mobility. The women of New York City weren't the only ones having fun. In the prosperous town of Greenwich, Connecticut, big impacts were being made on the young women who attended Rosemary Hall. While women's formal education was only just barely beginning to be considered a necessity, one Miss Caroline Roots Reese took great lengths and pride to provide the young women that attended her school an exemplary education that could and would stand toe-to-toe with the most elite education of young men at the time. The students of Rosemary Hall were not relegated to learn the usual womanly skills in their classes. Rather, Headmaster Roots Reese had the girls hone in their critical thinking skills, become near fluent in both Greek and Latin, and complete flawless poem recitations. Roots Reese's insistence on molding her girls into leaders gave way to opportunities like fire marshal and student government, allowing the young girls to have a real chance to step up and out of the traditional submissive roles women typically were confined to. However, traditional ideas of womanhood and femininity were not completely lost, with Headmaster Roots Reese claiming the philosophy of Republican motherhood, saying, "Parents also who have sons, and are thinking ahead about the characteristics which will be desirable in their sons' wives, have an interest in Rosemary." The centuries-long mindset of a woman's worth being tied to a man and his game still stood true, but at the very least helped to justify a superb education that could empower future generations of women. Women resisted the traditional ideas of womanhood and femininity through reshaping women's education to develop a more intellectual generation of young women and advocating for new attitudes surrounding love and marriage.
Our next stop takes us back to New York City. Russian Jewish women in the garment industry helped organize thousands of workers and spearheaded many strikes for working conditions. According to Barrett, women garment and mill workers were significant because of their ability to organize and create networks within their female communities. They accomplished this despite their lack of common language, union experience, female role models, or education. Frequently, wealthy, educated women provided financial assistance and backing, but it was the workers themselves who jeopardized jobs and incomes when they took to the streets. It was made evident that women must utilize the progressive reform movement to further their cause with events such as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of March 25, 1911, when 146 workers, most of them young women, died. Those who did manage to find the one rusted fire escape tumbled to their deaths when it collapsed beneath their weight. Let's take a trip to Lawrence, Massachusetts. Over 40 languages were spoken in the mills as they were filled with immigrants from all over. Women suffered a variety of occupational illnesses, such as tuberculosis and pneumonia. By 1911, an average of 1/3 of factory workers died before working 10 years. One half never reached the age of 25. By the end of 1911, rumors spread of intended wage reductions at the Lawrence mills. The reductions, coupled with shorter working hours for women and children, legislated by the state of Massachusetts, created fear among the already impoverished and exploited workers. In 1912, when the reduction became a reality, women marched shouting, "All out, short pay," a typical bread and roses strike. To sum up the progressive era from the female perspective, the movement both hurt and helped women. On the one hand, the mindsets of Americans across the country were slowly broadening to consider additional rights for women. However, At times, progressivism set back the women's movement for equality. Some reform-minded economists argued that the labor should be rid of unfit workers, whom they labeled unemployables, parasites, and the industrial residuum, so as to uplift superior, deserving workers. For many, women fell under this category. Leading progressives justified exclusionary labor legislation for women on the grounds that it would protect the biologically weaker sex from the hazard of market work and ensure that women could still fulfill household and familial duties, perpetuating maternalism and the foundations of Republican motherhood that still hung in the background.
Our next stop is Memphis, Tennessee, where in 1892, Ida B. Wells began her anti-lynching campaign after a white mob took the life of 3 of her friends, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart. Wells investigated the lynching of her friends and courageously published articles regarding it in her newspaper, Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, decrying lynching and imploring the public to take action against it. Perhaps as expected, her writing caused a significant amount of backlash. In fact, a mob stormed Wells' newspaper office and destroyed all of her equipment. Fortunately, Wells was out of town in New York at the time of the incident. She never returned to Memphis. Wells was also heavily involved in the women's suffrage movement. She established the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago on January 30th, 1913, with the aim of rallying women in the area to vote for candidates who would be most beneficial to the black community. Wells' influence as both a muckraker, any of the group of investigative journalists who exposed corruption and wrongdoing in politics and big business, and a social activist, can be felt to this day.
Our last stop brings us right back to where we began, New York City. New York City served as the heart of the later half of the temperance movement and saw the most evident development of a close link between the women's suffrage movement and the largely female-driven temperance movement. A temperance paper called The Lily wrote that women were beginning to feel powerless without the right to vote, since almost overnight the temperance movement became a movement for prohibition and therefore inevitably a political movement. And so women realized they must begin demanding political rights to keep up. The desire of temperance women to wield direct power in the fight for prohibition encouraged some to embrace the cause of female suffrage, the most radical feminist demand of the 19th century, since it constituted the greatest and most direct challenge to the male monopoly of the public arena. In the slums of New York, alcohol had taken hold of the working-class family, creating violence within the home. Best exemplified in Stephen Crane's Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, 2 children in a family of immigrants experienced domestic violence from a young age as a result of alcoholism. In Chapter 2, Crane describes a drunken physical fight between the mother and father. Quote, "In the quarrel between husband and wife, the woman was victor. The man grabbed his hat and rushed from the room, apparently determined upon a vengeful drunk." Unquote. Women fought for suffrage in order to ensure the survival of the temperance movement and to protect their families.
While the temperance movement established a symbiosis with the women's suffrage movement, the same could not be said for the civil rights movement. On May 12, 1869, the American Equal Rights Association, founded to secure equal rights to all American citizens, especially the right of suffrage, irrespective of race, color, or sex, held their 3rd and last annual meeting. Prior to the meeting, the shared desire for universal suffrage had already begun to crumble in the association. In 1868, a proposed 15th Amendment called for the end of voter discrimination on the basis of race, but no such language was added to end discrimination based on gender. In response, the association's leadership split as prominent members took sides for or against the proposed amendment. During the annual meeting, a fierce argument broke out between the two sides as they argued for why the marginalized group which they represented should be granted the right to vote first. Douglas argued that, "I do not see how anyone can pretend that there is the same urgency in giving the ballot to women as to the African American. With us, the question is a matter of life and death, at least in 15 states of the Union." Anthony rebutted that, "If you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in the government, let the question of woman be brought up first and that of the African American last." As a result of the brewing tensions and consequent clash, the American Equal Rights Association dissolved shortly after the meeting. In short, the temperance movement's need for the woman's right to vote in order to enact concrete change pushed it into a mutualistic relationship with the women's suffrage movement, whereas differences over who should get the right to vote first caused the civil rights and women's suffrage movement, once interconnected, to break up with each other. With that, our road trip comes to an end.
Today, there is less division between various groups than before. As Martin Luther King Jr. put it, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." However, since 1920 and the ratification of the 19th Amendment, women have still had to face a constant battle for equal rights, each time taking a slightly different form. There is much work to be done, but still we must acknowledge the foundation laid down by those who came before us.